Let me just jump into it. I do hate to catalogue all the tremendous foibles and ideological fields of insanity that enmesh culture. I was just going over in my mind some rebuttals against identity politics. As it's so obvious to me that there's a layer of psychological politics that underpins the reliance on something like identity politics, which is certainly a very dangerous reduction of issues and concerns, and it's a hideous reduction of life into terms that can only create fake solutions, artificial and unsustainable answers that have such a hard time vindicating themselves, that create such tremendous internal tension, which has to be scapegoated, or that there's a kind of implicit incentive to being self-aggravated in order to be on the defensive, because that is the only way in which the narrative becomes appropriate and applicable. You get all these sort of false flag things happening. It's ironic because the kind of almost the requirement to believe in a kind of conspiracy theory against your identity in order to justify promulgating and advancing your interests as a group, as a representative of that identity, as the vehicle of a kind of narcissistic self-righteousness, has so many kind of anti-reality requirements that have to be filled, that have to be pandered to. It ends up becoming a very unwieldy sort of beast, in that you have to keep everyone on the script, and you have to have everyone conditioned in a somewhat uniform way in order to kind of make it appropriate. And that only works when you've essentially got a narrative in which there's a conspiracy against your identity, and the perpetrator is working kind of intelligently behind the scenes, and so all you have to do is attack the enemy, and then you get progress. You don't even have to act intelligently and have real answers in terms of how to fix problems. That all just becomes too complicated, but we can just do the simple shortcut for now. We can do the convenient thing for now, which is just aggravate the system and destabilize it and bring it down. And this is, the general strategy that was used politically by the Nazis, even though their best critics understood that how their ideology operated, and they even denounced it as a sort of pathological mental illness. It was a kind of group delusion, and that is certainly what we see in identity politics, a kind of shared psychosis, or it certainly leads to that, even if, because you have to believe in such a low resolution narrative in order to make it work, because the more local you look at its elements, the more inappropriate it becomes, because it's so it can just make these kinds of statistical claims about statistical disparity but because, you know, it has no way to facilitate any kind of better outcome other than just dictating the outcome. It can only but undermine genuine development and transformation. And in fact, the kinds of transformation that it calls transformation are overtly corrupt, and and actually by the functioning of the ideology, which I would call ideological corruption, because it is the ideology of corruption. It means that a token must be given a benefit under that policy or under that intervention that the state offers. And so it is ideological corruption. It is the facilitator of a kind of artificial aristocracy that gets there by political affiliation, essentially. And the idea is that, well, everyone can share in that, and that as only some people share in it, perhaps it is because they do it on behalf of us all, which is obviously a lie. And, essentially, because you're organizing society like that, it just never actually gets off the ground, because it just essentially is it's the kind of, let's destroy the boat in order to make a life raft that has all the comforts of what the boat perhaps would have allowed us to arrive at, but let's destroy the boat and only a few of us will make it there in luxury. That's what ends up happening. And then because it's such an utter failure, it uses its own failure as fuel for why it is so self-righteous in some sense. So it feeds off of its own inherent failure. So as a model of development, it is so bad, it can use that as leverage to essentially be more violent, to justify more violence, to sort of self-aggravate itself up into a kind of hysterical advent, I've myself witnessed ringleaders do what I have seen done. Excuse me, I misspoke. What I have heard was done in Nazi Germany, where they would organize people to as a group go and loot a store or something like that, to try and build up the confidence, let's say, of radical defiance of destabilizing the current order. And this is what the Nazis tried to cultivate in order to get the mentality so that they could effectively orchestrate a successful coup eventually. And so you can see that this is where the kind of the crazy violence and the kind of the thoughtless destruction, so you just have buses being burnt down, trains being burnt, things just being destroyed, resources being destroyed, because it's sort of the token anger that something greater must be done, and that is really the context in which this expropriation without compensation is being pushed in South Africa. The obsession with the expropriation without compensation is a token of creating some kind of legal system in which non-racialism can be stripped out of the constitution and be stripped out of the current legal order. And so I think the idea, at least, is probably to be able to have a corrupt government that doesn't, let's say, loot the government coffers anymore, but can take directly from the private sector. So instead of perhaps having a slightly less corrupt government that can just take things directly. But I mean, obviously, it's just completely insane, because that would completely destroy the functioning of the economy, which needs to have clear and honest commercial exchanges. And you can't do that if no one has confidence in holding property. So it's a terrible idea. Essentially, I mean, the land reform in this country, which is funded by the government, has such a minuscule portion of the. I mean, it's generally all been stolen. It has been proven that the amount of money that has been put into land reform, if that money just went directly into buying land from the market, because every year land is sold, if that land was just bought with the money that's been put to land reform, that has essentially all been stolen and a lot of it has been corruptly misappropriated. If you had just bought land from the market, you would have had more than enough already. But we've only spent 0.3% of the budget on land reform. So how does, if land is really such a burning issue, then why not just spend more money of the budget? Why threaten the concept of private property? It's obvious what it is that they want a vague and a kind of very imprecise constitutional reworking that essentially allows for racialized double standards in terms of private property, so that you can keep on using the social evils of apartheid essentially to help cement the corrupt kleptocracy and the decadent, kind of. It's like all corrupt African governments, how they work. That they use sectarian identity essentially to cement their power, because when you've got an us and a them, when you've got a kind of narrative of being able to sell protection for your identity against the other competing identities, then essentially no one can try to stamp out corruption. No one can go after dirty or ineffective politicians because they're in this identity war, and so it's never appropriate, And the idea generally is that, well, the fascists can have their cake and eat it. They can always sort of say that, but once you have a state full of ad hoc laws of democratic dicta, that's usually how they dress it up, where you have this legal positivism which completely undermines any kind of principled equality before the law, which is exactly what they're going after. They're trying. They want the law to be changed as a wedge in for the fascistic line of essentially eternal corruption, which will be paid for by the scapegoats of their never-ending, unaccountable administration, because they're never responsible for any of the corruption. They're never responsible for any of the outcomes. They're never responsible for the lack of development, for the sabotaged economy, essentially. For the kind of the toxic corrosion of the labor market, which is just basically infected with racialized politics, essentially, because people's token values are much more relevant than anything else, and so you don't even have an effective way of retaining labor that has any kind of correlation with productivity, and so it's very hard to be a professional in that sort of environment of essentially token politics. I mean, if you are a real serious professional, you just leave because it's just too much to bear. It's hard enough having a successful business plan, and now you have to count people's racial profiles and you have to maintain certain numbers within your business. It's ludicrous. It's not possible. And it leads to subpar, it just, it's a, it does not actually generate real transformation, and then that's just the fuel for a second generation of intoxified race relations that essentially never goes away because we can't deal with the real problems on the ground ever. Now we have to deal with these secondary issues of ideological bullshit, which are so subtracted from reality, and they are so caught up in their own ideological machinations. And, you have to help them make their ideology fit reality more than actually doing something about fixing the reality. It's the reality of identity that becomes the prominent, essentially so that people can have a vehicle for their jealousy in some sense. There are some personality styles that are, I think jealousy is the best way. They're almost somewhat sadistic, but they're sadistic over this particular sort of concept of jealousy, and it becomes something that it's something like what Sam Vaknin talks about when he's going on about narcissism and how you can get a kind of collective narcissism and an individual narcissism. And at least in the West, we have generally had an individual narcissistic allowance, and there is, I mean, the people in identity politics would say, oh, there's an incredible collective narcissism. I wouldn't actually say that. I would almost say I think that is a misreading of it, and that's also perhaps a corrupted misreading of it, because that's one way to read it, to justify a kind of collective narcissism in reaction to it. And identity politics is definitely reactionary. By the way, it's obviously fascistic. It's obviously Nazi philosophy. It's not even different. There is no difference between the race and gender studies that is taught in academia in terms of how they theorize and the Aryan studies. It's just instead of going on and on about biology, they go on and on about historical configurations of essence. I mean, it's analogously, it's no different. It's the same thing. They're saying this is your this is the mark of your being, and you must conserve what has been imprinted upon you, and you must extol it and sort of collectively work to unravel it and sort of weave a new collective response to it, or something like that. It is. I mean, what is the difference between that and some kind of genetic argument about how you need to conserve your genes and how you need to promote your genes? It's the same fucking thing. What I was going to go on to say. I was just mentioning there's no difference between identity politics and Nazi philosophy, and just before then it was the psychological politics aspect. Yeah, the jealousy. Yeah, so I would generally refer to as the beta quadra in socionics, or the intuitive feeling quadra in MBTI, which are both approximate systems, but at least those are somewhat known about and somewhat defined somewhere that I'll vaguely point to there. But I would generally say about 30% of the population is inclined to intellectually attune themselves to some sort of they see themselves as a kind of as they monitor threads and lines of conceptual value hierarchy, let's just say, and what they're more interested in is jealousy as a kind of pervasive um, commodity in psychological terms. And these people, I think, often uh, they can have a rather sadistic um, investment in what they're doing. And they certainly, I always, whenever I come across these people, you get the very quick sense that these are people who, if no one was looking, they would do something. They would potentially allow themselves to do something, quite. Um, that's not to say that they would be so simplistically opportunistic. It would have to be part of a kind of a broader, um, almost Machiavellian narrative that they're engineering. These people are often very good at weaving um, manipulated social circumstances. That they are, certain people within the quadra at least are very good at staging and priming things to happen in a certain configuration so as to create a story that they are left with, which allows people to sort of to sympathize with them, and they will leverage this sympathy, and either they will get other people to protect their interests of their group or of their conceptual network, or whatever issue is involved. So they will often use morality, the concept of morality and the concept of integrity, but usually they'll use it in a specious way, and it is quite easily reducible to identity. Often they are obsessed about something to do with identity, and that's often the form of morality in which they are the the kind of the guardian of, and so in some sense you can understand them, if you analyze them, let's say abstractly, as being, even if they are being the victim in some case, or they're being very hysterical or emotional, or seeming weak, in some sense I would say that these people are acting as a kind of um, policeman of this kind of conceptual jealousy, and they are the enforcers of that, and what they will do for that is essentially they are taxing the people who believe with them, and are on who's who, the people who are on their side essentially are being taxed by their uh, um, investment, and they will often guard that their investment into their vision of sort of maneuvering this jealousy, and often I I have spoken to a lot of these people, and let's just say from my psychological insight, I will say they know what they're doing. They can literally cry. They can go through all the emotional cartwheels that you could imagine, and it's a fucking act. Like they believe it emotionally, but they don't believe it intellectually. But they believe it as they are expressing it. It's almost like disassociation, and it's because they've got this kind of fundamental core belief where they know that they are um, serving a kind of the god of jealousy. They're serving some kind of power in this world, and they have nothing better to do but to kind of promote that kind of factional feature of whatever it may be, and it's sort of it's a form of enslavement which they are kind of extending to those who they are associated with, and which they're trying to enmesh very cleverly. They're kind of almost these very clever agents, almost unconsciously sometimes perhaps, but I would say subconsciously is more maybe as they're putting their feelers out, they're doing it unconsciously, but very often I would say they are subconsciously moving to find opportunities to insert this greater network of coordinated energy that serves whatever form of jealousy they are the kind of the guardians of and the enforcers for. And they will put themselves and the people around them through a kind of tremendous emotional, yeah, and that's what they feed. They're almost parasitic on emotional energy. They need other people to feel their thoughts in some sense. So what they are thinking intellectually, they need to see it mapped out around them on other people's emotions. And so they've got this sort of web of reactivity that they are kind of, and these sorts of social, these sorts of personalities, these styles of personalities, have been encapsulated into certain cultures, more so than others. Often they find some kind of compromise because they are so toxic that they have to find a way to be limited in some sense, so that functioning non-pathological forms of reasoning can let's say allow some level of success. And so usually, because there are people in every population, there are portions of every population group that are going to have these styles of personality, and so they need a place within their society. They need something to do with their investment, and so every society has to find a place to sort of put that, right? And I would say that the West has in general been the best at confining and suppressing that feature within the population. I would say that the biggest time that they've, I can only think of some, sort of sparse examples in my head, but, so generally this kind of behavior always goes underground because it's generally, it's anathema to clarity and functioning, so generally these sorts of personalities have great, almost, I wouldn't even say charisma, but they have an obsession with power and control usually, but they need the emotional energy, so they can't have too much power, so the best sort of stereotype that makes this case, I would say, would be like the Godfather, so usually the kind of the underground mafia people, who have some sob story about being the underdogs, of being, there's always some excuse as to why they had to resort to criminality, why they had to be, how they, we were forced into extorting people and selling them protection, it has to be, there's always some cosmic conspiracy against them. Now, when you have that, it's always dangerous when, therefore, the mafia boss takes over, let's say, public power, because then you've got a runaway state, because then how does it actually create enough conflict, So, this is why Sam Vaknin has described, for instance, Nazi society as being a perpetual civil war, or at least a civil war that has to continue to promulgate its revolution. It's a revolution that never ceases. It's always in the state of revolution. And Lenin actually had a similar sort of concept, I would say. But Lenin needed, I would say that in Russian society, it had to be understood that intellectual. There is a very big crossover between, let's say, Nazi culture and the legal, I don't want to say legal, the organizational structure and stricture of the USSR. So you have to understand that these are almost two different facets of the same thing. But you see, the Nazis were actually living it as a culture, whereas the Russians, let's just say, were only thinking it as a, or they were forced to think it, as a kind of ideological orthodoxy, which they had to pay at least lip service to. And it was even better if they didn't believe it in some sense, but they had to toe the line. And so that is almost the only difference between Leninism and fascism in some sense. And then you can understand why perhaps there was a kind of a French intellectual yearning to have that same kind of Leninist tool of safely securing an orthodox dogma that would allow some kind of intelligentsia class to have a pervasive influence over the lives of the common folk who cannot be entrusted with a kind of libertarian Western, or let's say more English Western conception of life. I mean, it's almost hard to consider continental European culture as Western because of how badly Napoleon poisoned it, essentially. Completely stamping out the Roman Dutch legal system, essentially, which essentially left all the cultures of Europe, or at least of continental Europe, to sort of wallow in a kind of... I mean, there's essentially only one Western legal system that has had the core principles of a kind of clarity and of having a functional republic. You cannot have a functional republic without a functioning legal system that at least corresponds to the I can't think of an appropriate word, but corresponds to the values in a republic, and that doesn't really exist. The American constitutional order is problematic for many reasons. I'm not going to go into that. The British one is strange, but it is more so in the British common law, in the spirit of the British common law, but still it's not... it's strangely crystallized, let's just say, but there are elements, almost spiritual elements of it there, but it's only been properly captured by the Roman Dutch, so much so that it was respected by the British enough for it not to be... it was actually regarded as superior by the British, who took over the Cape, who took over South Africa, to not dismantle the substantive Roman Dutch law, and so it was preserved, and the superior British procedural law was inserted because the Roman Dutch procedural system was probably the weakest part of the canon. But anyway, this is getting very tangential, but in as much as the Napoleonic codes were seen as advanced and progressive, or whatever it may be, that is to the extent, and eventually when you have a legal system for long enough, it infuses the culture, so the legal culture becomes the residue of and the inherited culture eventually in a society, and so that is why we have what I think is the beginning of the end of the legal system in South Africa, which first is going to be to destroy the principle of non-racialism, and as soon as you do that, you have to create an endless stream of positivistic dicta, essentially, and regulation, which cannot be extrapolated in a principled fashion. It has to be authorized by power, and you know, essentially, I mean, the Republic is being openly threatened in that sense, and the Constitution is being openly threatened in that sense, and being undermined. I mean, even already by this constitutional review done by Parliament, it is the most hideous. I mean, it is embarrassing, in fact. I mean, it's almost a piece of paper that spells out a civil war in some sense. It is. I mean, in the implication of it, you know, essentially it is. We want to remove non-racialism from the Constitution. I mean, it says things that cannot be reconciled with the Constitution. It asks for things to be put into the Constitution that should not be there, essentially. It essentially says we want to keep the property clause the same, but we want it to also say this. So they want to sort of be able to pay lip service and then essentially have their corrupt, ideological, dysfunctional system of dogma that will come out and tell society essentially how to think. You know, so it's going to sort of say, no, you have to conceive of things in these terms, because we're going to depart from the principles, which, I mean, that's what the Constitution is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a collection of principles. But they are explicitly saying, no, we want it to have a kind of democratic dicta. That is certainly going to undermine Section 1. I mean, it only has an inappropriate value, because if you really cared about land reform, just do it with more money. I mean, like, why undermine the whole tax base? Why undermine the economy? Why undermine the trust and confidence in commerce? Just essentially to create a token to make the racialists feel better about themselves, that they've got something. You know, the whole thing is designed to race bait a society. The whole thing is race baiting. That's what it is. That's the purpose of it, is to create enough upset to then react to with more radical violence. So they'll say, oh, they're complaining that we want to expropriate them without compensation. Now we should kill them, perhaps, because they're not happy when we just want something for ourselves. And, oh, you know, they did this to us in the past. They should shut up and let us do something back to them. They should know that we'll only do it until we deem it necessary, that things have been fixed. And then, you know, never mind the complaint that things will never get fixed when you've got this level of dysfunctional government and corruption, which should definitely never be the holders of such an unbalanced power that it has certainly not earned or deserved with its track record. The idea that such extraordinary power should be given to people who essentially are masters at criminally stealing money from the country, I mean, is just ridiculous. But this is the general form of politics that happens in corrupt African countries. Is you have identity politics concealing corruption, essentially, in social issues, making it a social issue. So you can get the people on your side, so you can get the worst people riled up and give them sort of social power and cultural power, to give the wrong political people power, who are not even accountable for delivering, essentially, because the less that they deliver, the more they have the right to take things, the more they have the right to intervene and to sabotage and to corruptly aggregate things. And the idea is that, well, it's fine, it's good enough, because the poor are also suffering, and so if the people of the right identity suffer along with them, then that's a net gain for the ideology. So it's this kind of, it creates a false zero-sum obsession. As a convenient diversion. I'm just repeating myself at this point.